Hello students, continuing on with History 2112. This time we're going to talk about immigration to the United States during the Gilded Age. And then, as now, there was a backlash against immigrants in the form of people who wanted to restrict immigration and especially restrict voting to native-born Americans. And so we call anti-immigrant people nativists. I want to start out by talking about an iconic image that was very dear to the hearts of immigrants as they sailed into New York City from Europe, the Statue of Liberty. But it's interesting, the official name of the Statue of Liberty is actually not the Statue of Liberty. It is Liberty Enlightening the World. The idea that American liberty is a shining light that's going to transform all of humanity, expressed in this title. The sculptor was a Frenchman named Frederick Bartholdi, and of course he made the statue in copper, which is why it appears green now, because as copper ages and rusts, it turns green. Eventually, originally it would have been a sort of reddish orange color. This sculpture was a gift from the people of France to the people of the United States, and it reflected a long-standing tradition of friendship between those two countries, dating back all the way to the time of the American Revolution, when France was our most important ally in gaining our independence from England. It was brought to New York and assembled and dedicated on Liberty Island in New York Harbor in the year 1886. And if you've ever been to the Statue of Liberty, you know that at the foot of the pedestal there's a plaque that has a poem engraved on it about the Statue of Liberty. This poem is called The New Colossus. It was written by a woman named Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus was not an immigrant, but she was an American-born Jew who knew many immigrants and who sympathized very much with the problems of immigrants. And so she wrote this poem to celebrate the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of hope for immigrants. I want to read you this poem, but before we begin, just to mention something that may help you understand the first couple of lines. The original Colossus was a large statue of the Greek god Zeus from the ancient world that stood supposedly straddling a body of water between the island of Rhodes and the mainland of Turkey. It was a massive bronze sculpture, which is why she refers to it as brazen in the first line. So, The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Well, this is a very important poem in American history. Let's analyze a little bit. So, at the beginning, she's comparing the Statue of Liberty to that old sculpture, the Colossus of Rhodes, which was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. What is she saying here? She's saying the Statue of Liberty is not like that ancient statue of the powerful god Zeus. Instead, for this sculpture, a woman has been chosen to represent the United States. and especially to represent it to new immigrants coming into the harbor. Why is this significant? Well, if you think about it, the fact that the Statue of Liberty is a woman makes her a little bit more welcoming, perhaps nurturing, motherly towards the immigrants. Now, she is a powerful woman. Lazarus says she's a mighty woman with a torch, but she's also the mother of exiles, and she has a worldwide welcome. That is, she welcomes anybody from the whole world who wants to come to America as an immigrant. And then a little farther down, Lazarus has the statue saying, "Keep ancient lands your storied pomp." That's complicated, old-fashioned language, but storied pomp would be wealth or riches that people talk about, that's famous, that people tell stories about. So what's Lazarus saying here? She's saying, we Americans, we don't want that kind of wealth, riches, and power from the old world. Instead, she says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That's what we want. We want the poor, the downtrodden, the homeless from all over the world to come here and make a new life. And so she says, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Well, very beautiful poem, and a very pro-immigrant poem from Emma Lazarus in 1886. Who were these new immigrants during the Gilded Age? Well, there were a lot of them, about 11 million coming to this country from various places in the world between 1870 and 1900. During this period, most of the immigrants were from Northern Europe, about 25% from Germany, 15% from the mother country Great Britain, 13% from Ireland, and 10% from Scandinavia. Those are the northernmost countries in Europe, places like Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And it's interesting that most of these countries were made up of Protestant Christians, not Catholics, except of course for Ireland, which was mostly Catholic. We'll talk more about that in a minute. What helped to increase this surge of immigration in the late 19th century? Well, for one thing, as ships became faster, and instead of old-fashioned sailing ships, you have steamships, the price of the fare to get across the Atlantic Ocean dropped quite a bit. That made it possible for more and more people to come. Also, communications were better, especially after the laying of the transatlantic telegraph cable. The mail service was better between America and Europe. And so immigrants who had already come over could send letters or sometimes even telegrams to their relatives and friends back home and invite them to come too and talk about the opportunities in the United States. Also, large corporations, when the economy was good, would often try to recruit laborers from the old world to come over and work on big projects. For instance, the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, the different groups of immigrants often took very different paths once they got to America. The Scandinavian immigrants, many of them ended up out on the Great Plains, especially the northern part of the Great Plains, places like Minnesota and Wisconsin. German immigrants, too, usually did not settle in the large cities on the eastern seaboard. Instead, they would typically move to the Midwest as well, to places like Missouri, for instance, that has a very large German population. What enabled them to do this? Well, the German immigrants who came over generally were pretty prosperous, and they usually had some skills and at least a little bit of money. And so they didn't have to stay in the eastern cities. They could afford to move on west and buy land in the Midwest and set themselves up as farmers, or sometimes purchase a store or a shop, like for instance a blacksmith shop where they could be artisans, do some kind of craft. The story was very different, however, for the many Irish immigrants who came over. And often these Irish immigrants were dirt poor and usually came over with nothing but the clothes on their backs, typically could not read or write, had very few skills. And so when they got off the boat in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, they had little choice but to stay in those large eastern cities and to try to get jobs wherever they could, usually the lowest type of manual labor, say sweeping the streets or working on a dock, loading ships, things like that. And this brought them into competition with African Americans who, of course, because of discrimination, had very few job opportunities during this period and typically had performed these menial tasks. And so this led to a lot of hostility, especially between Irish immigrants and blacks as they were competing for the same jobs, hostility that sometimes broke out into rioting and open violence. But it's interesting to note that even though African Americans were certainly the group that was most discriminated against in American society during this period, the Irish immigrants also suffered a great deal of discrimination and a great deal of prejudice. For example, in cities, if an employer was advertising for workers, they would often hang up a sign in their window saying, "No Irish need apply." Why was that? Well, again, the Irish typically were uneducated people, and based on the British heritage of many Americans, they had been trained to see the Irish as very uncivilized, primitive people, almost subhuman. And if you look at the cartoon on the left, this was from a very important American national magazine, and it's depicting an Irishman. On the left there, the figure of an Irishman. And if you look carefully at this image, you see a number of characteristics that were believed to belong to the Irish. First of all, this man certainly doesn't look very intelligent. In fact, you could say he almost looks like an ape, doesn't he? Almost like a member of a different species. And also, the fact that he's got that big stick under his arm, what the Irish would have called a shillelagh, and a knife in his hand, would tend to suggest that he's a very angry, aggressive, and dangerous person, a violent person. These were all stereotypes of Irish immigrants to this country. Furthermore, another issue for the Irish was their religion, because nearly all Irish belonged to the Roman Catholic religion. And this, too, aroused a lot of suspicion, because at that time there was a great deal of hostility between Protestants and Catholics, and many Protestant Americans believed that Catholics could not be good citizens of America. Why? Because it was believed that Catholics had to take orders from the Pope in Rome in all things, and many Americans feared that the Pope would be able to gain influence over American society through these Irish immigrants and perhaps even eventually take over. And again, you see that reflected in the cartoon too, because the man on the right is a Roman Catholic priest, and clearly he's the one giving the orders to the Irishman, who is carving up a goose that represents the Democratic Party. What is the cartoonist saying here? Well, even though the Irish were rejected by many Americans, there was one group in the United States that actually embraced and welcomed Irish immigrants, and that was the Democratic Party. Primarily because the Democrats realized that these immigrants could provide a huge source of votes for their party. And you have to understand that in those days, um, there wasn't the very long waiting period that immigrants have today before they can vote and exercise citizenship in this country. In fact, at this time in American history, an immigrant could vote just as soon as he stepped off the boat, that is, if he was an adult male, as long as he promised that eventually he would like to become a citizen, he was allowed to vote. And so this was a great bonanza for the Democratic Party to recruit all of these newly arrived Irish immigrants to help them, and in return to expect the immigrants to vote for them. And there were very important Democratic political organizations that were chiefly made up of immigrants. The most famous one was called Tammany Hall. This was a political powerhouse that basically controlled the politics of New York City for many years, and it was largely staffed by Irish Americans, and it became a way for Irish Americans to gain influence over the political process through working with Tammany Hall. And in fact, with Tammany's help, some Irish even began to be elected to citywide or even statewide or federal political office in the late part of the 19th century. On the other hand, there was a large backlash among many Protestant Americans, especially against the Irish immigrants. This became an issue in the election of 1884 when Grover Cleveland defeated James G. Blaine. During this election, one of Blaine's supporters, a minister named Samuel Burchard, gave a famous speech in which he called the Democrats the party of rum and Romanism. And it's quite interesting. These Irish immigrants and many other immigrants brought with them their drinking customs. But by this time, many Protestant Americans had become teetotalers and wanted to ban the sale of alcohol in America. And so, by calling the Democrats the party of rum and Romanism, it's saying that they've allied themselves with these immigrants who have this dangerous tendency to alcoholism. And as I mentioned before, the main fear was that Catholics would be controlled by the Pope. If you look at this cartoon, another cartoon by the cartoonist Nast on the right-hand side, you see Protestant Americans cowering in fear on a beach. What's coming at them out of the water? Well, they look like crocodiles, don't they? But if you look more closely, you'll see that these are actually Catholic bishops wearing their bishop's hats coming over to attack and take over the United States. So you see the real depth of this fear. It's maybe hard for us to understand nowadays, but it was very real in the late 1800s. So reformers, people who wanted to eliminate corruption in the government, often would direct their efforts against immigrant organizations and democratic organizations like Tammany Hall. For example, in 1883, the Congress passed a law called the Pendleton Act, which was designed to make sure that people who had federal jobs got them because of their actual skills and qualifications, not because they were political payback for some favors handed out by groups like Tammany. There was also a very significant issue that had to do with the public schools related to this fight between Catholics and Protestants, because in those days, governments, state and local governments, would often give tax money to religious schools. This was, in fact, the normal thing to do, and many of the schools throughout the country had been founded by Protestant churches, and they had gotten tax dollars to run them. But as more and more Catholics began to come to the United States, the Catholic Church too opened schools, and they asked for public funding for their Catholic schools, and in some cases they actually got public funding. And this angered many Protestant Americans who were totally opposed to their tax dollars going to support Catholic schools. And so really, this controversy over Catholic schools was the beginning of the process that transformed our public schools from religious institutions into totally secular ones, in which God or the Bible or religion had to be removed from public schools. Why? Um, Mainly because Protestant Americans did not want to support Catholic teachings in public schools, and so eventually people settled for the solution of, well, let's just not give tax money to religious schools at all. The main organization in America that fought against immigrants, especially Catholic immigrants, was called the APA, the American Protective Association. This was a popular group founded in 1887 that sought to restrict immigration to this country. So you see that the kind of rhetoric we've been hearing in this year's presidential campaign from some of the candidates blaming America's problems on immigrants is really nothing new in American society. In fact, it has very deep roots in these late 19th century nativist organizations. Nativists became even more concerned as the 19th century progressed, because in the last decade of the 1800s you see a very important shift in patterns of immigration. If you look at this map, you can see what's happening. On the left there, between 1871 and 1880, you see the largest dots, the places most immigrants are coming from. Places like Germany and Great Britain and Scandinavia. But if you look at the right, by the first decade of the 20th century, which dots have gotten bigger? Well, the dot over Russia and Italy, and also Austria-Hungary, that was a very powerful empire of the time in southeastern Europe. Many more people are coming from these Eastern and Southern European areas, and that was significant because the vast majority of these people were not Protestants. They were usually either Catholics or Jews, and so that really tended to set off nativist fears and raise their alarm against immigrants even more. But even more hated than Catholic immigrants or Jewish immigrants were Chinese immigrants. Why was that? Well, there were many Chinese laborers who were brought over for various purposes. We already talked about how they helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. They were often involved in the mining business, in growing fruit and vegetables on the West Coast especially. However, the Chinese, in the eyes of most Americans, never seemed to really fit in to American society. First of all, they were from a totally different religious tradition. I mean, some were Buddhist, some worshipped other gods, but they were by and large not Christians. Okay, and that was a serious problem. For example, in the legal system, you know, when we go to court, that we have to testify in court, what's the first thing we do? They ask us to put our hands on a Bible and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Well, Chinese immigrants really couldn't do that because they didn't believe in the Bible, and so they were not seen as trustworthy, partly for that reason. Also, there was a stereotype that Chinese women were mostly prostitutes, and this had a little kernel of truth in that nearly all of the Chinese immigrants were men who didn't bring their wives or their children, and so the few Chinese women who came over often did wind up working in prostitution in cities like San Francisco. But obviously, that stereotype was unfairly extended to all Chinese women based on the activities of a few. Also, Chinese brought with them, in many cases, an addiction to a drug called opium. Opium is a very powerful narcotic drug. There are two common drugs today that are made from opium. One is morphine, used as a painkiller in hospitals. The other is heroin, very powerful and dangerous street drug. So this was a very serious problem in Chinese society, but to be fair to them, it was actually the British who had started importing opium from India into China and selling it to the Chinese people. And when China tried to stop the opium trade in the 1840s, the English actually fought two wars so that they could continue selling drugs to the Chinese people. So, in a way, it was Great Britain that was actually responsible for the problem, but it was true that a pretty good percentage of Chinese people were addicted to this drug. Um, and so they brought with them um, opium, which they smoked in places called opium dens, kind of like modern day crack houses, and this added to their reputation as being dangerous people to have in society. Finally, just like African Americans, because they were subject to so much discrimination, Chinese workers would often accept jobs as scabs, that is, strike breakers, working even during a strike. Famous example of this was in 1870 when a large number of Chinese were brought in as scabs to break a strike in a Massachusetts shoe factory. And so, for this reason, labor leaders hated the Chinese. A famous quote from a San Francisco labor leader named Dennis Carney. He said simply, "The Chinese must go." So even labor turned against these Chinese immigrants. For all these reasons, in 1882, the U.S. Congress passed a very severe law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which essentially cut off all immigration from China. There were still some illegal immigrants who managed to find their way in, but they would have to lie and pretend that they had a very close relative here already in America. That was the one loophole in the law. But even after the Chinese Exclusion Act, hostility and hatred towards Chinese immigrants continued. There was one very notorious incident in 1885 at a mining camp in a place called Rock Springs, Wyoming, where the American miners surrounded the poor little shacks of the Chinese miners, set them on fire, and burned 28 of these Chinese workers to death. So that gives you a sense of how Americans did not welcome the Chinese. In fact, the term yellow peril was often used in speaking about Chinese immigrants, that Chinese immigration had to be stopped or it would swamp the United States. The labor unions, especially the AFL, American Federation of Labor, were also often hostile to immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, places like Russia and Italy. Why? Well, in factories, as capitalists, big business tycoons adopted new and more sophisticated machines, they would often end up firing skilled workers because machines could now do their jobs. And they could hire then illiterate, uneducated immigrants to operate these machines because you didn't even have to speak English in order to operate them. And so the AFL was afraid that immigrants would take the jobs of skilled American workers in this way. But many capitalists were also afraid of immigrants because they believed, especially the immigrants from Eastern Europe, were under the influence of communist ideas or anarchist ideas. Anarchism is a way of thinking that says that there should be no government at all. And so capitalists believe that if you let in too many people from places like Russia or Eastern Europe, that you would be bringing in danger in the form of anarchists and communists. Even people that were basically sympathetic to immigrants would often express a certain level of fear about them. And an important example is the author Jacob Riis, who in 1890 came out with a very important book called How the Other Half Lives, which is about the slums, the immigrant neighborhoods in New York City at that time. And Riis's goal in this book was basically to show people how this other half of society, the poor half, lives, to educate middle class and upper class Americans who were living lives of luxury as to how this group was actually living. Groups 2 and 3, after the first exam, you will have readings from how the other half lives. But even Reese would sometimes play on people's fears about these immigrants. Here's a quote from his book. A man stood at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 14th Street the other day, looking gloomily at the carriages that rolled by. He was poor and hungry and ragged. Then he sprang into the throng and slashed around him with a knife, blindly seeking to kill, to revenge. End quote. So again, there's this idea that unless we do something about the problem of these poor immigrants, that they might lash out at prosperous people in American society. They might become violent, and this aroused a lot of fear. But the main reason why Reese's book had such a huge impact was not his writing, but the photographs that he included in the book that documented the lives of immigrants and really brought it home to many people who couldn't imagine these kinds of living conditions. So I want to show you a few of these pictures. This is a picture of a tenement house. Those were very crowded apartment houses in New York City, and this apartment in the tenement is being rented out to homeless people, essentially for 5 cents a night. So for a nickel, you could gain the privilege of sleeping with a whole bunch of other guys right next to them, probably who hadn't taken a bath in several months, but at least it got you off the streets for one night. This picture on the left shows you the kind of unsanitary conditions in which people are simply throwing garbage out into an alley. But on the right, perhaps even more dangerous, you see some really violent looking thugs here who obviously see this alley as their turf. Definitely not a place that you would want to walk on a dark night. Many of Jacob Riis's photographs were of what he called street Arabs, that is, homeless children who lived on the street in New York City and had to find food and shelter any way that they could. These children are huddled together, desperately trying to stay warm. Here we have a depiction of a dive, that is a bar, in the neighborhood called Africa, which at that time was the main African American neighborhood in New York City in lower Manhattan. So you see this is a black and tan dive in Africa with a mixed race clientele. This has become a very famous picture, and people call it the Slum Madonna. If you're familiar with art history at all, you know that the pictures of the Madonna, that is the Virgin Mary and the child Jesus, were a popular subject for painting for many centuries. And this immigrant woman holding her baby reminds people of the Virgin Mary living in this really this rat hole here in a tenement slum. This is a picture of a Jewish man, a Hebrew master ready for Sabbath, in a coal cellar. So he's getting ready to perform the Jewish ritual to celebrate the Sabbath, but the only place he has to do it is in the basement here in this dark, dank cellar. Also, we see some Bohemians. These are people from what's now the Czech Republic, making cigars in their home, and so they would work from sun up to sundown, the entire family working together on this task of making cigars. And of course, child labor was very common in those days. Obviously, these children are not going to school because they're busy helping their dad make cigars all the time. Well, books like Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives and other publications roused quite a bit of sympathy among a certain class of wealthy Americans who wanted to help these poor immigrants. The most famous example of this was a woman named Jane Addams. Jane Addams was from a wealthy white American family, but she always had a desire to reach out and to help people that she saw as less fortunate than herself. And so in 1889, she moved to Chicago and founded a place called Hull House. This was the first of what became known as settlement houses, where wealthy Americans, usually wealthy Protestant Americans, would go to live in the inner city in the slums, and they would try to work with usually poor immigrant populations to try to improve their quality of life. And it was really Jane Addams who launched this very significant movement in 1889 with Hull House. Group 1, after the first exam, you'll have a reading from Jane Addams about some of the problems she encountered there at Hull House. Addams and her associates were also active in politics, trying to improve the lives of poor workers. One of the Hull House residents, Florence Kelly, managed to convince the Illinois State Legislature in 1893 to pass a law saying that women from that point forward in Illinois could only work 8 hours a day. But as often happened during this period, this law was struck down by the courts, by the United States Supreme Court in 1894. So the political process often was not the best place for these reformers to get their message across. Instead, they would typically found organizations to work with poor people and to try often to change their lifestyles and their culture. One example of this, a very important group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. What is temperance? Well, primarily temperance has to do with restricting the drinking of alcohol, and temperance reformers wanted to ban this production and sale of alcohol in the U.S., and of course they eventually did succeed in doing that with prohibition. We'll talk about that later in the course. But because alcohol was a part of many immigrant cultures, these activists really felt that in order to become true Americans, these immigrants should give up drinking alcohol. They also took on other issues like prostitution, sanitary conditions in the cities. They wanted to support homeless shelters for people, and even votes for women. There were also Protestant ministers who talked about, at this time, what was called the social gospel. The idea that if Christ were to come back to earth in, say, the 1890s, he would be involved with the poor people. He would go to live with them. He would care for them. He would not simply ignore them. All of these tendencies of reform had one view in common, and that view was that the problems of the immigrants in the cities were not a result of their being bad people. In a sense, they weren't even the result of their bad choices. All of these reformers blamed the slum environment for the problems of the cities. They thought that the unsanitary and dangerous conditions in urban slums were causing the epidemic of crime and disease and early death that was seen in these immigrant populations. And so they all focused on changing the environment of these immigrants in hopes of making their lives better. And one way that they sought to change the environment of the cities was to bring a little bit of the countryside into the city. And so it was in the late 19th century that urban reformers created green spaces in cities like Central Park in New York City, and large parks in other major cities as well. The idea was that if you could get a little of that countryside fresh air and greenery into the city, that perhaps people would behave a little bit more like country farmers who were believed to be more peaceful and virtuous. There were also amusement parks that appeared during this time, like the famous Coney Island in Brooklyn. The idea of this was to get people off the streets and keep them occupied having fun instead of doing antisocial things. Sports, too, were believed to fulfill this function. You know, if you could get a kid off the streets and get him playing baseball instead of joining a gang, then society would be better. So it's in the late 1800s that the first professional baseball teams appear in American cities. All of this connected to these urban reform movements. So, to close, you can see from this map regions where there were a great many immigrants, and it's quite a remarkable statistic that in the 1910 census, you see that 1/3 of all Americans either were actually immigrants or their parents were immigrants. So, in a very significant way, in the late 19th century, America did become a nation of immigrants.